Hello and welcome again. I'm Mike Hixson. So glad to be with you today. I've got Aaron Gallagher with me. Aaron does a great job with GBN. Aaron, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for your time. And in our study today, we want to talk a little bit about deacons and the role of deacons. And I know that probably among some, there is maybe a misunderstanding of the role of a deacon in the Lord's church. But let's just talk from a biblical perspective, maybe first and foremost about God's organizational structure in the church. You know, from a universal standpoint, the Lord's the head of the body. But then in a local setting, you have men that serve as elders or bishops, overseers. But then also there's another special work that is designated as deacons, or really the word deacon is a servant. But when we talk about the role of a deacon in the Lord's church, I guess what comes to your mind?
Well, I mean, I immediately think of, you hit the nail on the head. You said a special servant. You know, the word deacon, meaning servant, is used in many different ways. You know, there's a technical term, which you'd see as, you know, the elder, and then you have a deacon. It's sometimes called the office of a deacon. Yeah. And there's a non-technical term. So sometimes people will be confused by that. And when you look at the word deacon, it just means servant. You know, Jesus is referred to as a servant. It talks about maybe in Mark 1 that the angels, they came and ministered. That's a form of that word, deacon. And so there's even sometimes people have misconceptions about whether women can be deacons because
a Phoebe.
Yeah, Phoebe will be used. That word deacon or servant, diakonos is the Greek word. Mm-hmm. But you have this technical office, which, you know, we'll get into the qualifications, but they're really just special servants.
And you know, if you think about every Christian is a servant. Mm-hmm. We're all servants of the Lord. Now, it's a different type of servanthood. I know in the first century you had, there were a lot of people that were oppressed by the Roman government. Mm-hmm. You had millions of slaves. And of course, that wasn't a voluntary type of slavery. Mm-hmm. But when we talk about becoming a Christian, for example, in Romans chapter 6, where Paul talks about how we've obeyed from the heart that form or pattern of doctrine delivered. And he said, being made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. And so it's a voluntary type servanthood.
That's right. You know, Jesus said basically, he that wants to be first, you know, the head, let him become a servant of all.
That's right.
So all Christians are servants in one sense. You know, Paul called himself in 1 Corinthians 3, 4, and 5, he called him and Apollos, you know, Paul and Apollos, they're servants. That's the word diakonos. But when we're talking about the office of a deacon, there's additional qualifications, and it's that special work. You know, some people argue about it, but Acts 6 seems to be the first place you sort of see this, you know, acted out, where there are some Hellenistic widows who are being left out of this distribution. Mm-hmm. And in Acts chapter 6 and verse 2, I believe it is, you know, the apostles essentially say, look, we don't have time to give up preaching the word to serve tables. And so they appoint these special servants for a special need in the church there to take care of these widows. And they appoint, I think, 7 men there.
Yeah, I think this is a template in many respects of how we select men to function in this capacity. And they had to meet a criterion set forth by the first century church, in other words, by the apostles in that day and time. They were to identify men that were of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit. And I would take that to mean that these men had already had apostles lay hands on them, and so they had spiritual gifts. Then, of course, they were to be men of wisdom. And the purpose was that we might appoint them over this business. And you remember, I like what Luke records in verse 4. He said that we may give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word, which says to me that when you look at the work of the church, you have different areas of work, different roles and responsibilities. And so we have to identify those roles and responsibilities, and then identify men or identify people that can best fit those responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've heard different people say things over the years where sometimes you have the elders doing the job of the deacons, and the deacons are doing the job of, well, who knows what the deacons are doing, you know?
Exactly.
Sometimes people get this idea that a deacon is just an office and you're a deacon. It's like, well, what work do you oversee? Well, I'm just a deacon. It's like, well, you're in this, they appointed men to be over this business.
That's right.
You know, so like I'm a deacon at South Haven. At one point, the elders had me as deacon over education. I'd, you know, arrange the teachers, and of course the elders would advise me. And then I was the deacon over evangelism. And it's like, so the works, you know, can change, but you know, you have a work, you're appointed over the business. Yeah. And that's what they did here with these men.
Yeah. You mentioned I like the term you used, that deacons are special servants. We're all servants. And Jesus, of course, was the model servant. Paul identifies that in Philippians chapter 2. But a deacon is a special servant. It's not just a term.
Yeah.
Like, well, he's an elder. And that's not to say that a man doesn't wear that particular name, but it's not a title, it's a work. The same thing's true with regard to a deacon. So it's not, well, I'm a deacon in the Lord's church. No, I'm a deacon, but I have a special work that I've been appointed over.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, when you look at the qualifications, you in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 8 through 13, if you look at that, you've got in verse 10, but let these, verse 8, likewise deacons. Verse 10, let these also first be tested, then let them serve as deacons, being found blameless. So there's this idea of there's been a certain amount of testing or responsibility that's been given to them in some, form or fashion prior to them becoming deacons. I think about, in our congregation, deacons are the ones that handle the treasury.
Yeah.
That's not the sort of work you want to just give to anybody. You want to make sure that person
somebody who's
tested.
faithful.
That's right, but faithful, and he's not a new convert. We know him. We know his character, and of course, there's other qualifications there in verses 8 through 13.
You triggered a thought in my mind, and that is, I've heard people say sometimes, "Well, let's appoint him as a deacon, and then maybe he'll be more faithful." Well, that's not what Paul said here.
No,
let a man first be proved. You want somebody that really meets that criterion. And furthermore, that has demonstrated over a period of time that he is faithful in the Lord's work.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at these qualifications here, starting in verse 8, going through 13, they must be reverent, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy for money. Not greedy for money. That's you want to make sure this guy's not greedy for money before you put him over the treasury, right?
Exactly.
Holding the mystery of faith with a pure conscience. So they're faithful men. And then in verse 10, let them be tested. So that I'm a deacon. It's an honor. I don't have any, sometimes I think people have this misconception that you have the elders, of course, Christ is the chief shepherd, 1 Peter 5. And then you have elders, and then the deacons are the rulers under the elders. It's like, no, I'm a servant.
Yeah.
My job is, what do you need me to do? The church has needs.
Well, yeah, I think sometimes people have this idea that deacons are junior elders. No. They're special. Really, an elder is a special servant.
That's right.
We're all Christians. We're all servants. We're all members. But you have some people that occupy certain works like eldership, deacons, evangelists. We're all the same, but we just have different areas of work. Let me ask you this. We talk about Acts chapter 6 and that template set forth there. I know that many times deacons take on works that are more physical or maybe material in nature. But if I understand Acts chapter 6, there's also a spiritual dimension. For example, Philip was an evangelist.
Yeah.
And Philip did a lot of good. Matter of fact, he went to Samaria, preached the gospel. We have an account of him talking to the eunuch that was on his way back home from Jerusalem. So there is a spiritual dimension of that. And don't you think that elders ought to want to see men who function in this capacity growing in that area?
Oh, absolutely. You look at 1 Timothy 3, whether it's the qualifications for elders, pastors, bishops, whatever word you want to use, it's all the same office, or deacons. Those are things that all men should aspire.
That's right.
Now look, an eldership may look at a deacon and say, hey, he has some characteristics that one day he could grow into an elder.
That's right.
But you just think about, if you have a deacon over Benevolence, you want that person not only to be wise with regards to the money, but also to analyze these spiritual needs. If you have a deacon over education,
That's right.
And I think the other thing I think is important from Acts 6 is looking in verse 2 at the apostles, of course, but the apostles essentially said that preaching of the word is too valuable for them to essentially take care of these other tasks. Look, these tasks are important and we want faithful men to do it, but we can't give up preaching of the word to serve on tables. And I think that's important for elderships to remember as well.
Well, I think so. You mentioned that old phrase, and I've heard it for years, that elders are doing the work of deacons. Who knows what deacons are, and
who knows what they're doing?
Really, what I've heard is preachers are doing the work of elders doing the work of deacons, and then who knows what the deacons are doing. Well, and there probably is some truth to that. But to understand that the role of elders is a spiritual work. And in Acts chapter 6, the apostles needed to give themselves to prayer and the ministration of the word.
Yeah.
And it's not, as you said a minute ago, that they were too good to wait on tables.
Sure.
It's just that the Lord needed them to use their talent, their ability in a greater way, in a more spiritual way.
Yeah.
And I think by the same token, elders, it's not that it's beneath an elder to, worry about who's cutting the grass or, what color this wall is going to be or, a lot of other things, but rather his role is among the flock, among the sheep, and caring for those sheep. I mean, after all, he's going to give an account of those people. So
I remember when I was in North Carolina, I got asked to go speak at a congregation, like a fill-in spot. So that's what I thought it was. So I went over and spoke one weekend, and I was pulled into a room and they started to interview me. I had no idea this was a job interview. And they were asking me, what is your approach to this? And of course, I'd never been a located preacher. I'd never been to preaching school, right? But I remember them saying, so what is your approach to counseling? And I said, that's not my job. That's the elder's job. And maybe there was part of it that was naive, because I know preachers can counsel, but they were asking, what is your approach to visiting the sick? And I said, look, I've loved visiting people. Like, as an individual Christian, I said, but a lot of these things and honestly, I didn't know it was a job interview. So I wasn't trying to.
Yeah, I understand. You weren't trying to impress.
No, I wasn't trying to impress. And so I was just being honest. And maybe there's a little bit of, naivety, but I just said, well, aren't those the elders' jobs? I thought the elders were supposed to be the shepherd of the flock, and I think they were maybe a little stunned, and I didn't mean to, I wasn't trying to offend anybody, but just as a young person, and I didn't have any of the training. I didn't know what goes on behind the scenes a lot of places. Sure. And so what I think they were asking me is what a lot of preachers are expected to do in a lot of places, but I didn't know that. And so I was just saying, why are you, if you're asking me about a preaching job, aren't these things the elders should be doing? Yeah. And sometimes elderships, and maybe it's because they learned it from prior elderships. I've never been an elder. That seems like the most difficult job on the face of the earth. But I think some places look at it as a board of directors.
Well, I think so. Yeah, I could make the case that, with the exception of maybe in situations where there is, maybe a need for private counsel or maybe discussing the overall work, that really an office for an eldership is really a misnomer, because the elder's office is the field.
Yeah. It's a work. It's almost like that high church word of office maybe did more harm than good when it was translated. I think maybe the King James was the first one. And of course, you had a lot of this, 3. Yeah. You had this Church of England idea that I think the translators may have been playing to, but you're right. It's a work. It's not just an office where
That's right.
You're appointed. I mean, you're appointed, but it's a work. I think about if I was an elder in a congregation and I had a couple who was struggling with something, I would want to be the one that counsels them.
Exactly.
I wouldn't necessarily, maybe your preacher has a PhD in counseling and maybe you'd say, hey, he'd do a better job. But just in a lot of cases, I'm thinking, hey, if I'm the shepherd, I'm in charge of their soul. I want to be that person who, if they're an elder, they have that wisdom, So I think that would be something I would want to be leading the charge on as an elder.
Yeah, you would hope so. I remember talking to a friend of mine who, a very well-respected preacher, and he was talking to a congregation about possibly working with them. And they were going over some of the things that they wanted him to do. And one of the things was they talked about visiting the sick. And he said, look, if you want me to visit the sick as a Christian, I can do that. Yeah. He said, but now if this is a part, and I'm not trying to misrepresent him, but I think he said, but if you want me to visit the sick as the quote unquote preacher, he said, this is a deal breaker. I can't do it. And obviously, they allowed him to visit as a Christian, and he took the work. But I think it may be the case that we have sort of fostered this as preachers. We've taken on a role that's really not biblical. And we've done the shepherding and the pastoring in many cases. And then the elders have taken on more of the material side. And then, kind of back to your point, I don't know what the deacons are doing. They just got a title, and that was never God's design. No. And the wisdom of God in the whole process is reflected in Scripture.
Well, I think, I do remember one time I was at a congregation. It was in North Carolina, and I went up to one of the elders. His name's Bob. And I had been asked, I wasn't a deacon then, but I always told them, hey, I'm not qualified to be a deacon yet, didn't have kids yet, but I'll do whatever you need me to do. And I went up to him and asked him about, I think they wanted me to repaint the lines on the parking lot. And so I had experience doing that, Parks and Rec, when I was younger as a first job. So I said I'd be happy to do it. And I asked him a question about it. I forget what it was. And he said, hey, that's great. Talk to the deacons about it. And I remember at first kind of being like, okay. And then I was like, wait, that's a good thing. He was essentially saying, hey, the deacons are handling that buildings and grounds, and he was one that taught Bible classes quite a bit. So I remember that at first it was kind of caught me off guard. And then I realized this is, the way, and I'm not a located preacher. So I guess I can't get fired for saying this, but when I read the New Testament and I think about mimicking the pattern, it's where the elders are regular teachers. They are trying to help their congregation grow. They're the ones that are visiting and spending time with the members.
Sure.
You have the deacons who the elders are saying, hey, take care of the grass, take care of the baptistry, and there's a leak here, you handle this, so they can focus on the word and visiting. And then you have a preacher who's teaching, but if I was an elder, I'm not an elder. But if I was, I think sometimes the preachers get caught up in they have so many expectations that they're in their office all week long. I would, as an elder, almost say, hey, look, we're going to give you as an eldership, we're going to give you a budget of, I don't know, $50 a week, but you only get to use it if you spend it out in the community. I want you going to if you're going to work on a sermon, go work out at a coffee shop, where other people are. Talk to people about, invite them to worship.
Sure.
That's the main place I evangelize. I go to coffee shops and I see people studying their Bible and I'm like, hey, what are you studying? And start conversations. But I also know that a lot of times preachers are on, tight budgets.
Sure.
And so if you expect a preacher to be out in the community,
they don't have that kind of funding.
No. And, they're going to talk to their wife about a budget and they may say, hey, look, we don't have this kind of money to just waste at a coffee shop. Well, if an eldership says, hey, this is $50 and if you don't spend it at the coffee shop, you're not going to see it any other way.
Yeah.
That's almost to me is like, well, I better go.
Incentive.
Yeah, it's incentive to be out in the community.
And isn't that biblical? Like in Acts chapter 17, when the Apostle Paul went to the city of Athens, he was in the marketplace.
Yes.
And he was among the people. Yeah. I mean, there was a reason why he went to the synagogues, because that's where, you had an audience of people.
Religious people are.
Yeah. And so, I think that's a great point.
I feel like coffee shops are like my synagogues, because that's where every coffee shop I go to, I see people reading their Bibles. It doesn't matter anywhere in this country that I've been to. That's like the Mecca for people that want to go in, and read their Bible and drink their coffee and tea. And I've had so many conversations start just from saying, hey, what are you reading? There's a young guy once is reading Acts. I said, you better get in trouble if you read that book. And he's like, what do you mean? I said, where do you go to church? And he told me it's a denominational church.
Yeah.
I said, you better get out of the book of Acts. And that led to a study where we studied about Calvinism, studied him out of Calvinism. He never obeyed the gospel, but it was just from being in a place where someone was reading their Bible.
And I like your approach. You just ask a question, which Jesus often did that. He would ask questions, and that oftentimes spawns a conversation. That's how he got a conversation with the woman at the well, Jacob's well in Sychar. So great. So let me ask this question. We talk about deacons and their role and the importance of their role. And I want to maybe talk for a moment or two and just a second about some of their responsibilities. But why do you think sometimes there's a blurring of the lines and elders tend to get more involved in the work of deacons? It's like they have deacons and maybe they have assigned deacons their role, but there is this hesitancy to relinquish the reins.
I mean, I guess I'm a fairly type A personality. So I could see that if I was an elder, I would think I'm the most aged, I'm the most experienced. If I'm, a group of men of elders, hey, we as the elders are more experienced. So we may look at something and say, hey, we could do the best job. And maybe they would do the best job on buildings and grounds. But at the same time, if you keep things in their proper perspective, you'd say, okay, which is more important,
Sure.
Whether the grass is 2.5 or 3 inches high, or whether the preaching and teaching of the word. But I also think that there may be something to the fact that a man who meets the qualifications for an elder, he probably is a servant in and of himself.
That's true.
And so he probably wants to help with these things. So I could see an eldership that wants to help with things that almost has to fight tooth and nail to say, I know I want to help, but there's a more important role that I need to fulfill, and that's preaching and teaching for people's spiritual growth.
Like in 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter talks about how elders are to be examples to the flock. And I think about, you're demonstrating servant leadership. I was in Chick-fil-A one day, and I remember somebody dropped something and made a mess on the floor. And the guy that owns the Chick-fil-A, immediately started cleaning it up. And I thought, man, that's so impressive that like he didn't ask somebody else, he just did it. And I thought that's servant leadership.
Yeah.
And so I see that that's a great point.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes there's sort of a hesitancy to let go.
Yeah.
And I've wondered sometimes, okay, is it because they feel more comfortable in the material, physical realm than the spiritual realm? It's like we talk about, I don't think the apostles were too good to wait on tables.
No.
But if a man's a heart surgeon,
Jesus washed feet.
Yeah. I mean, if a guy's been to school and he has the ability to do heart surgery, I mean, it's not that he couldn't mop a floor. It's not that he's too good to mop a floor, but is that really the best use of his talent?
Yes, that's a perfect point. Because if you have elders who are apt to teach, skillful in teaching, they've likely spent their lives perfecting the craft and they're mature, knowledgeable spiritually.
Sure.
They could easily mop the floor, but they're more suited, and maybe it's the return on investment. Their most valuable use is teaching. And then you have other men who are younger, and maybe they aren't at that level of being, skillful in teaching yet, but you still want them to be involved.
Exactly.
And so this is a perfect role that they can fulfill. And maybe they don't edge with a weed eater as well as a guy who's been doing it for 50 years, but it's like, that's not the point. The point is the most important thing spiritually in the body is training and watching out for the souls of the people.
That's right.
And the most mature, aged, qualified men that are elders, they're probably going to be the best at that, the most return on investment, if you want to say.
I think so. So in Acts chapter 6, we have sort of a template there. Their role was benevolence. Benevolence is a key work of the church. I mean, after all, the Lord commands us to demonstrate benevolence towards those who are lacking in certain physical situations. So what about the role of benevolence? Because we live in a day and time when there are a lot of people out there that will take advantage of you in a heartbeat. So you want somebody who's, as Jesus said, wise as serpents, but harmless as doves.
Yeah. I remember at South Haven, there was some individuals that came by and were asking for, money. And I wasn't the deacon over benevolence. There's two other guys I think that work on it. I don't know if one is the deacon or if they're both, but anyway, I remember asking them, like, so what did you do? Like, how did you handle it? And they said, oh, well, we've learned. They had some wisdom. They said, we just call some of the other local churches of Christ that we know. They called Olive Branch. And they basically would get the person's ID so they could say, okay, we know who you are. But they would find out, that this person had to go into every church of Christ. They may have called Nesbitt. They called a bunch of local congregations and found out that this person gave the same story. And then I've even heard of ones where they, you want to look out for the poor, but you also want to be wise with your money. Mm-hmm. And I've heard the story about at a congregation where maybe our preacher Robert was at. I forget where the story was, but this person would come through like every year with the same story about one of their parents dying. Yeah. And so it's like, wait, so your mom died, and then the next year your mom died again, and the next year it's like, okay, maybe I could have got your mother-in-law and your mom, but now the third, fourth year in a row that your mom's died. And so it's like, those are just some of the things where there's wisdom when you're over that work. And, you can seek out, that's another thing you could do, is you could talk, of course, to the elders about, hey, how can I do my job the best? What are some wisdom? And you could also contact other deacons at other congregations.
Find out how they operate.
Yeah. Who is the deacon over evangelism at your congregation or benevolence? And how do you do that? What are some things that you do? What are some things I'm brand new to this that I might be able to learn, from you?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a moment ago that you function maybe as educational director.
I was the deacon of education for a while. Now I'm deacon over evangelism.
Okay. So in terms of like a deacon functioning as an educational leader or director, what were some things that you did maybe to help keep?
Well, I would talk to the elders about who they wanted to be the Bible class teachers because they knew the congregation the best. And so then from there, I was the one that did sort of the legwork of, okay, we know who wants, what quarter can you teach? What topic do you want to teach on? And of course, I'd consult with the elders if it was something I was, if it was, hey, this is more of a spiritual aspect. Who do you want to teach this class? And we had a group text. So they were a lot of involved, and they would text me, hey, this person would be great for this class. But that's what I did with the education, and then making sure that they had the books were ordered, making sure that the teachers had their books. A lot of this sort of just like the legwork,
just
and then with regards to evangelism, it was, okay, what are some different things in the community that we can do? So I would call newspapers and call the radio station and, we have a radio spot here on the country radio station.
Okay.
The noon spot. It's like a 1-minute devotional. Our preachers now write some columns for the Herald Tribune. What's the Memphis newspaper? The Memphis newspaper, whatever
Commercial
it's
Appeal?
called.
No. Tribune?
Yeah, I think it's Tribune. So just basically as over evangelism, it's me trying to brainstorm what are things we can do in the community to
So do
reach.
you sort of collaborate with the elders and other, or, like I think about trying to invest in the community or trying to make an impact in the community.
Yeah. So I normally will try to brainstorm. And so I called the city of Olive Branch. I called the city of South Haven, city of Hernando. And I said, hey, what are some events you all have during the year that we could get involved in?
That's pretty cool.
So when can we come and set up a booth? I called some retirement homes. Hey, could we set up a worship service for your retirement home? Called the radio station, the newspaper. And it was really interesting. You don't know how God's providence works. But when I called them, 3 different places, the newspaper said, it's so funny that you're calling now because we've been looking for a new columnist.
Really?
I called the radio. They said, it's so funny that you call because we have a noon spot that just opened up. Are you interested in it?
Sure.
And one nursing home said, it's so funny that this is all in the same week, Mike. It's so funny that you called because the denominational pastor who was conducting our service, it just told us that he can't do it anymore. And so here I am, and I'm saying, hey, who knows? Perhaps. I can't know it's God's providence.
Sure makes you think that.
But it makes you think, was God waiting for, us to get off our backsides and do some work? And all these things perfectly lined up. And so essentially then what I would do is at the elders, deacons, preachers meeting, I would bring these opportunities to the elders and say, these are the 5 opportunities that we've come up with. And of course, I'd ask, does anybody have any other ideas? And you'd present them to the elders and say, this is what I'd like to do. And then the elders would meet privately and they would text me, hey, we want to do this, this, and this. That's good. And so I'd say, thank you. So it's a lot of it's serving. It's the legwork. It's the kicking up dust, which I think is where that Greek word comes from.
In terms of maybe guys that are serving or maybe guys who aspire to serve one day, what are some things that you would say to them to encourage them in that role? I
mean, I would say read 1 Timothy 3, 8 through 13. One of the qualifications in verse 12 is that you must have a godly wife. So, okay, if I want to be a deacon one day, let the deacons be the husband of one wife, ruling their children and their house as well. I want to be a deacon one day. I have to have a wife who, verse 11, their wives must be reverent, not slanderers, temperate, and faithful. So I know, hey, it's important to marry a Christian woman.
A good woman.
Yeah, a good woman that loves the Lord. So I would just say, if one day your goal is, which the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3, every man should aspire to, whether you ever end up being qualified for an eldership or not. Okay. I'd say read 1 Timothy 3, study what those words mean, and try to live your life in a way that you can meet those qualifications. And when you're young, you don't realize it, but the decisions you make today can impact tomorrow. And so you don't want to live in such a way so that you disqualify yourself from serving in a particular role because of poor decisions. And you're going to raise kids that if you're thinking about a spouse as a young man, you're going to raise kids with them. You need to make sure you have a wife that if something happens to you, if you were to die, that she's going to raise your kids faithfully. Amen. Yeah. Aaron, so good to be with you. Thank you for your wisdom and thank you for being with us today. Hope to see you back here next week. Until then, God bless.